the coldest winter, I think it was called, about when James Brady was a Marine platoon leader in Korea. But before they went overseas, they went to a party down at Jim Brannaman's house, and a bunch of them were there. And one of the guys that was there got killed about a month after getting into Korea. But and Brannaman, I guess, went over as a platoon leader for recon, which was just came back from Chosin Reservoir. So kind of interesting.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Chosin, huh?
Yeah, frozen Chosin.
So he was in Korea, Brandon.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
For 13 months. Yeah, he's an interesting guy.
All right.
And then, okay.
I don't know. He's been there longer than I have.
All right, so you and I are going to talk.
Oh, okay.
So don't even pay attention to that guy over there.
Okay.
If that's all right with you.
Right.
Okay. So we're just going to ask a couple of questions and just kind of want you to basically just elaborate on it. And if you have any stories you'd like to share, anything you remember you'd like to share, just please do.
Okay, yeah.
And again, reiterate the questions when he asks them, just so when we cut this, we
You'll know the context. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So why did you join the Marines?
The Marines had the reputation of being the toughest outfit there was, and I just wanted to see if I could measure up and hang with the toughest guys in all the services. I was 18. I worked at the San Leandro post office, and there was a Marine recruiter there who would take me out for coffee and talk me into joining. And it was interesting because I talked a buddy of mine into joining, and we went down and we signed up for a 2-year enlistment. We got down to Oakland to the induction center, and they told us, "Oh, sorry, there's only no more 2-year enlistments. You have to go for 4." And I said, "No, we don't." We said goodbye. And we'd already had, big parties, going away parties and everything. So we went back to San Leandro, and we went to see about joining the Army, see if we could get a 2-year enlistment in the Army, and they wouldn't give us a 2-year enlistment. So we happened to run into the recruiter, and the recruiter says, "Hey, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in San Diego." We said, "Hey, they told us we had to go for 4 years," and I said, "No way." And he said, "Well, let me talk to the captain." He calls up somebody, and he said, "Well, listen, we can get you a 3-year." And I said, "Oh, what the heck's another year?" So when you're young, it doesn't make any difference. So went in for 3 years.
So how did you end up on the Curtis?
I put the C school down as my third choice. They asked us what we'd like to do, and I had been in the Navy Reserve for 2 years. I'd been a parachute rigger, and I didn't want to go aboard a ship. And so I thought, well, I'll join the Marines. I won't have to go aboard ship. So I put down that I wanted to be a air controller first, and an air wing second, and then C school third. And anybody that put C school down got it, because they needed a lot of C school guys.
Gotcha. So is that how you end up on the Curtis? Or,
Right, and then they took almost everybody that graduated from C school that could go past their interview. And
so describe the interview. How did that go? What did you have to do?
They just asked us about our background and I think it was a typical employment type, with a lot of emphasis on security in your background and what you wanted to do. And we were talking about this last night with Jim Brannaman. It's amazing that everybody in our platoon turned out really well. They really got good jobs. We got, one guy's a psychiatrist, another guy was in charge of all the special ed for the state of Iowa, and a lot of the guys got just exceptional jobs because I think they were motivated, and I think Brannaman was the type of guy that could pick who was motivated and who wasn't motivated. And it wasn't so much a physical, like the SEALs where they eliminate everybody, because of the physical endurance they have to do. But I think it was a lot of how you did mentally, and I think he was a good judge of character.
So was Brenneman the one choosing people?
Yeah,
or-
he was the one. We had to go past his, and he was the only guy there interviewing us. And it was interesting because I went up to visit Jim up in Washington where he lived, and he was telling me, he said he had no idea or couldn't find out from maybe when the Curtis was going to come into port. The Curtis had gone every year or every other year. They used to go down to Acapulco, and the ship was down to Acapulco. And one day he happened to look out, and him and Chet Stanero, who was the executive officer, they were the commanding officer and executive officer of the 1st Marine Training Battalion, and also they had taken a lot of the Marines that had been on the Curtis for the greenhouse operation and put them as drill instructors at MCRD, so they would have them there as part of the Curtis detachment when they needed them. And Jim said he went over to the ship and he said, when am I supposed to bring my Marines aboard ship? And he says, you better have them here in 2 weeks because we're going. But it was also top secret. He couldn't find out from anybody. And he had something like a $750,000 inventory they had to get aboard ship, all our extra equipment and things like that.
So what was the life like on the Curtis?
Well, there was 62, 63 of us down in a little compartment, a little bit larger than this room, and it convinced me that I should go to college. The only difference between myself and an officer who got $500 a month and we got $85 a month, and the living conditions was a college education. And the day I got out of the Marine Corps, I went to college. It thoroughly convinced me that was the strata of life. If you had no education, you got a menial job, or if you had an education, then you got good pay and good living conditions. So, but there was a great camaraderie. What's that word? Where you're all buddies? Yeah, and we all hung out together, had a great time. We all looked out for each other's back, and we'd have great times. We went on Liberty, and they were just a super bunch of guys to hang out with, and we had a great time. And guys like Red Dog McKenzie were the funniest guys in the world. And they had and I'd go out with Halderman and some of the guys, and Halderman and I were really close buddies, and we'd go all over on Liberty. And even he got promoted up to sergeant, and I was still PFC, and we'd still hang out together. And it was just a great group of guys, and we all, and I think we went on some special missions together. And like Halderman, myself, and a guy named Gene England, and there was 3 other guys, and I can't remember for my life who they were. And Chestanero, and we picked up the hydrogen bomb and transported that, and there was 3 of us on duty at all times, and we'd be on 4 hours, 4 off, 4 hours, 4 off, and then it got down to 3 hours on, 3 hours off, 2 hours off. We didn't have enough people, and it was a 185-mile trip from Eniwetok up to Bikini where we took the hydrogen bomb, and so we got real close living like that.
Any interesting, maybe funny stories that you had?
Well, it was interesting because when we went down to Eniwetok, we carried 45s and Thompson submachine guns, and we had no place to leave our weapons. And so we had to carry them with them every place we went, and we had pith helmets and short khaki. We were wearing short khaki pants and short sleeve shirts, and which was kind of uncommon. And we kind of stuck out with our weapons. And we had some colonel come by and said, "Hey, would you guys like a ride?" We said, "Yeah." So we got a ride to the Chow Hall or someplace with him, and he said, "Who are you guys?" We said, "We can't tell you." He said, "Oh, okay." That's the way things were there. And I think they paid us something like $5.95 per diem, but nobody ever asked us for our money, so we never paid them. And it was tough duty, but we made the best of it. We had the island. When when our ship left San Diego, we came up to the Bay Area, and we pulled into Port Chicago. And from Port Chicago, and I don't remember this, of course, everything was top secret anyway, and you didn't ask questions. And they took a couple guys off our ship and took them up to Travis Air Force Base. And at Travis Air Force Base, they picked up some components of the bomb, and with a big security force they had FBI agents, they had county sheriffs, and they had local police. They transported that back to Concord, and then at Concord they also picked up a bunch of parts of of course, most of the scientists were all from the Lawrence Radiation Lab, which is in that same Bay Area there. And when our ship was at Concord, they put out security guards, and we had Coast Guard cutters. Anytime we came inside the Golden Gate Bridge, we would have 4 Coast Guard cutters around us to guard us. And then they wouldn't let any boats, pleasure boats or any private boats, within so much yardage of us. And we went up to Concord, and we had to put out patrols around our ship. And one of the guys was out there patrolling one night, and he heard this noise, and he'd halt, who's there? And they had the passwords and all that. He kept hearing this thing coming towards him. He halt, and he wound up shooting, and he shot a cow. And so they took up a collection. We had to pay the farmer for his cow, and that was about the funniest thing that happened at Concord. And then as soon as we left the Golden Gate Bridge, then 4 destroyers would be our guard.
Gotcha.
Oh.
Who shot the cow?
I don't remember that.
So, other than the bomb, what was the most intense moment on the Curtis?
I think when we heard that there was a Russian submarine that was following us, and apparently Mackenzie was the admiral's orderly, and he told us that he had to go wake up the admiral one night, and then the admiral went up the bridge, and they had to make some decisions because his submarine apparently had waited for us, and had on the bottom of the ocean apparently, and then came up right under us. And I think it was almost like a game of chicken in those days. Almost anything could have set off, World War III. And but that was something that was kind of interesting.
Okay, if you're comfortable, tell me about the bomb, and if you had any chance to see it again, would you?
Oh, I definitely would. I thought what we were doing was in the highest interest of the country. We had to do this testing because of the threat that the Russian they were building the biggest bomb they could, and we were building the biggest bomb we could. And when we set off the bomb, I remember when we got to Bikini Atoll, they were building a huge concrete bunker, and they were going to film the bomb going off. And then we went down to Eniwetok to Japtan to pick up the bomb. Well, I forgot to tell you that one of the funny things was there were Army guys on Japtan, and they had these little corrugated metal guard sentry boxes. And to keep us awake at night, we'd go find a great big piece of coral and then run up and throw it against the side. And some Army guy would be inside, and it would just scare the heck out of him. So that's how we got our laughs. And then when we got up there, and they were going to set off the bomb, they told us if we didn't close our eyes real tight, we could lose our eyesight if we looked at the bomb where it went off. And they made us sit on the deck and face away from the islands, put our arms over our eyes, and I had my eyes closed just as tight as I could get them. And when that bomb went off, man, I could see a bone in my arm. Man, that was the brightest light I've ever heard in my life. And then the the day was a beautiful, beautiful day, and then the weather changed. We saw the big plume, and then it turned into an overcast day, and then we could see a ripple of I think it was a shock wave like that came, and you could see it coming across the water, and it wasn't a big one, but it was different from the rest of the waves. And we were 23 miles away, and they set off the equivalent of 15 million tons of TNT. And so it was an awesome sight. And then after we were milling around, we went up on some higher decks to check things out. And we had AEC people, Atomic Energy Commission people, that were go around the deck patrolling with Geiger counters. And the guy came around, he says, "Hey, you guys better get out of here. We're really getting a high reading." And so then they announced that everybody had to go below deck, and they put us at condition able. They locked down all the hatches on the ship, and they put Marine guards with 45s at all the hatches, and they said no one was supposed to go outside. And they kept us that way for, I think it was about 3 days. And they shut off the air conditioning, and the poor guys down in the hole, or down in the engine room, they could only stay down there for about 15 minutes at a time. And I know we got underway and got out of there as fast as we could, because they were concerned about our safety, I think. And of course, you were never told anything, so you always had to guess. But in retrospect, I think that with it being, I think they thought it was going to be about 6 megatons, and it wound up being about 15 megatons. And 4 days later, when we came into Bikini Atoll, the island was completely gone, and there was a 1 mile wide hole in where the island used to be. So they obviously it was a little more powerful than they thought it was. And it's interesting because I play softball, and there was one of the scientists. He was a scientist at Loren Radiation Lab for 35 years. I play softball with him, and we talk about different things that they did at Loren. And now they've changed the name of Lawrence Radiation Lab, and they call it Lawrence. It has nothing to do with nuclear anymore. Just to change the name, and I can't remember the name they changed it to, but.
That's very interesting. If you could relive your whole military experience again, what would you do different?
I think I might stay in the military. My father was a naval officer. He was a commissioned warrant officer. He was in during World War I, and he was on the only major ship that was sunk in World War I, the USS San Diego, and it was sunk off of New York City. And there's controversy of how it was sunk. They thought it was sunk by mines that were left there by the Germans. And my father was a machinist mate down in the after engine room, and the explosion that sunk it was in the midship. And he says, you don't hit mines midship. He says you hit it in the front of the ship. And they went down so fast they didn't get off a SOS. And so they were 13 miles from Fire Island, which is off of Long Island in New York, and they could see the lights in New York at night, and they were out there for 3 days. And he put his cigarettes up in his flat hat, and he was the only one that had cigarettes on their lifeboat. And I think 6 sailors died in that sinking. And then he has a career. And my brother, my younger brother, and I both joined the Marine Corps. And then my youngest brother, he was a Navy SEAL, and he still works for him. He's a career SEAL guy.
Gotcha. So this reunion, what's one of the highlights, or what is the highlight to you of this reunion?
Seeing the guys, and I'm closer to these guys than I am to anybody in high school or anything like that. These guys, we were together for 3 years, and we were just all living in the same compartment, and went on liberty, and we knew everybody's closest problems. And we had one guy on our ship. He was a Cherokee Indian, Charlie Irwin. He was from Winslow, Arizona, and when he came in, he arrived at San Diego airport the same time we did, and they threw us in the back of a truck. And there was 6 guys with Charlie that were all Indians, and not one of them spoke a word of English. They were Navajo Indians. And this sergeant that was driving the truck that was going to take us over to MCRD, he puts his head inside this truck and he says, "Are there any Indians here?" Charlie says, "I am." He says, "You're in charge." And I thought, you just have to be an Indian to be in charge of in the Marine Corps. But anyway, Charlie, he got a Dear John when we were in Hawaii. And he couldn't open the letter and read it, so he asked me to read it for him. And so I read it for him. And the poor guy, he goes out and marries the first girl he meets, which was a little Asian gal. And then Charlie and I were stationed. He slept right above me all the time in boot camp. And then he was stationed with us on the ship. And then we both went to 29 Palms for the last 6 months of our career. And Charlie, and I ran into Charlie in Oklahoma. I went down to visit him there, and I asked him, I said, "What happened to that gal you married?" And he says, "Oh, we got divorced, and she's cleaning rooms for the Days Inn in Tucumcari, New Mexico." And he's remarried, and he moved to Oklahoma because that's where his parents live, and he wanted to support him in there.
So it's seeing the guys.
Yeah, it's you're just so close with them, and you guys go on Liberty, and we went on Liberty one time with Halderman and a guy named Paul McCafferty. And Paul McCafferty, we were going to go to Los Angeles, and for some reason we got on a bus and went to Tijuana. We lost Paul in Tijuana. This was a Friday night. We go to L.A. Halderman and I. We couldn't find Paul, so we go to L.A. and we come back Sunday night to go back to the ship, and we in those days you couldn't wear civilian clothes aboard ship, so we all belonged to the Seven Seas Locker Club down on Broadway, and so we go into Seven Seas Locker Club to change back into our uniforms, and there's Paul McCafferty sleeping on top of the lockers, and we wake him up. We said, "Hey, Paul, it's time to come back to the ship." He says, "No, it isn't. It's only Saturday." He didn't know it was Sunday. He didn't know. Paul just passed away, and he had 3 different kinds of cancer, and he fought it for a long time. He fought the VA. He sent in his records to the VA, and he had 44 pages of medical that he had 3 different types of, and they kept stonewalling him. And so Paul was an interesting guy. He was from Columbus, Ohio. He owned 3 cabinet companies, and he had a contract with Burger King to build all their cabinets worldwide. And so he also done some work for the governor of Ohio. And so he was walking down the street and saw the ex-governor's office. So he walked in, he says, "I'd like to talk to the ex-governor." And the gal says, "I'll have him call you." So he calls the next day, calls Paul, talked to him. And he says, and Paul tells him his problem with the VA and his cancers and stuff like that. And the governor says, "Paul, I'll call you. I'll have somebody call you in 3 days." He says, "Okay." Paul says, in 3 days, John McCain called him and said, "Paul, you got a full disability, and his wife had been Carlene had been in the Air Force for 10 years, and she's got free medical for 10 years. Maybe she wasn't in for 10 years, but 10 years came in there. I think she got free medical for 10 years. And it was interesting that John McCain would be the one that called him, but I think it had something to do with the committee he was on in Congress or something. But anyway, then he got I think it was only fair. Like, I've been fighting the VA, and it's like, the VA's, it's like they're waiting for all of us to die before they'll do anything. And I've had a claim in 3 different times. I must have a pile of papers I've put in about a foot thick, and but
that was actually going to be my next question. With the VA, and we just a lot of guys have been talking about having problems. What's your story?
Well, with the VA, like in the Marine Corps, you have to requalify every year. You're around a lot of gunfire. You're around, especially going through combat training. They're always setting off explosions, and you're throwing hand grenades, and you get a lot of loud noises, and that can't do your ears a lot of good. They never gave you fire, any type of protection when you're shooting your rifle and everything, and you had to requalify every year. But we were on 40 millimeter mounts, and we'd fire those things, fairly often aboard ship. And then I was a gunner after I got off the 40 on a 20 millimeter. And a funny story is that they would have a plane pass over with towing a target, and on the weapons aboard ship, they put Cosmoline on it to protect it from the sea air. And I was firing this 20 millimeter at this target that this airplane was towing, and the Cosmoline started to get smoky, so I couldn't see. So I just kind of went where I thought the target was going to be, and I hit the wire that was towing the target, and it was fairly close to the airplane because the target came down like a parachute. And so I told the guys, I said, well, anybody can hit the target, but I'm the only one that could hit the line, which is only about an inch wide, but it was just a... But anyway, being around all that, and then when I got off the ship, I went to 29 Palms, and I was in a AAA battalion. And in the AAA battalion, we had quad 50s caliber machine guns that were on half tracks. And these were for anti-aircraft purposes. And then we had M48 tanks. They had dual 40 millimeter tanks or weapons on them, which were also anti-tank. And they were one of the most effective weapons they had in Korea. And anyway, but it was a lot of noise, and I think it did a lot of damage to my ears. I've had a ringing in my ears since I got out of the Marine Corps. And when I was tested for my hearing at the VA, they said, some gal came up and she says, oh, that ring in your ears is just old age. And that's whoever does your final review, that's the impression that they leave with the board that decides. And I told a guy that I was with, that I played golf with, who was in Marine Air Wing, and he was in a lot of battles in World War II, and he went and applied for his, and he got it right away. He gets $250 a month tax free for the rest of his life, and the most you can get for a hearing loss is 10%. So it's not like it's a whole bunch of money, but it's more the idea of it than the actual money.
What do you think they try to avoid everybody?
I think it's just their policy. It's just their Washington mentality. They just waiting for all the veterans to die. Just like Paul with his 44 pages of, and it's interesting. They've gone from, there were only 8 to 10 types of cancer that were presumptive. That meant if you had a certain type of cancer, it was presumed you got it from radiation. Now there's 21. We had one guy, Pistachio, he was a sergeant. He's probably the fairest sergeant in our outfit on the Curtis. He died of brain cancer in '89. The guy owned 2 restaurants in Las Vegas. And I told his wife, I said, you ought to put in a claim. And so I worked with her, and she put in a claim, and it was denied. And she said, well, it's denied. I said, well, put it in again. She put it in again, and she got it. She says, I could have held out for a lot more, but I don't really think she needed it. It was just that she wanted them to acknowledge that her husband died as a result of what happened over in the Bikini Atoll. And, I think that's what getting something from the VA is really about. It's not about, that there is a lot of blame there. And a guy that I played golf with, I used to play golf with quite a bit. He passed away. He was an airborne guy. His after they filed, they had a quit doing atmospheric testing of the atomic bombs. They came out with Operation Plowshare, which they were supposed to find peaceful uses of the atomic bomb. What they wanted to do was they wanted to use the atomic bombs, say like to build a new Panama Canal. But before they could do that, they had to set off a bomb in the United States, or bombs. So they decided to set off 5 or 6 nuclear devices up in Alaska to build a new harbor. And the state of Alaska said, you have to have biologists check all the surrounding area and make sure that it won't cause problems and stuff like that. One thing they found out in this, that the lichen that the caribou eat, which is the major food supply for the Indians, already had radiation in it, and radiation doesn't dissipate from lichen. And most of this radiation all came over from the Russian tests. And anyway, it was finally denied that and this was in 1961, that they couldn't shoot make this harbor. And that was Edward Teller. And this was in a book called The Firecracker Boys. And it mentions our tests, and the scientists and the hierarchy of the Lawrence Radiation Lab, they just totally ignore the consequences of what radiation does. They say, oh, it doesn't hurt anybody, but I don't think so. I don't believe them.
So how many reunions have you been to?
I've been to I would say 8. And then we started having mini reunions, and I was in charge of about 3 or 4 of those. 4 of those, I think, at Laughlin, and we'd just meet there and we'd get a room for $25. And then I was in charge of one of the I was in charge of the 6th reunion at Las Vegas. And it was interesting, when I was out at the airport picking somebody up, I had a Marine hat on, and I was on one of those moving elevators, and there was one going the other way. And some guy said, hey, Semper Fi. He says, I was in the Coast Guard for 29 years. And he says, I was in the Marine Corps 1 year. He says, but I still consider myself a Marine. And so I thought that was amazing. So.
Yeah, so you've been to 5 or 8?
8.
8.
And I was in charge of number 6. And I thought, yesterday at the reunion, my wife asked me, she says, or at the air show, she said, what do you think was the best part of the air show? I said, shaking every one of those guys' hands that walked by our chalet. I said, every guy had a strong heart, and he looked you straight in the eye. And I said, man, those guys are bigger, stronger, and smarter. And I was telling this guy that we had wounded guys, next to us, and we were talking with those. And this guy says, well, I don't know about smarter. I said, but they're a terrific bunch of guys, and they're really warriors at heart.
So that was kind of the big moment for you.
Yeah. That was bigger than the general coming by, because the generals come by a couple times and shook our hands. But these are the guys, boots on the ground. These are the warriors. They're like the one kid that was wounded that had he had the leg problem. The guy with the crutches. Guy had the crutches. He'd been to Iraq 3 times, and I guess he had his leg ran over or something in an accident. So, but he'd been in for 5 years, and he said he was going to stay in for 20. And, but these kids they're awesome. Yeah.
So I mean, we're just talking to the other guys. It seems that through these reunions, there's less and less people showing up.
Well, yeah, there's attrition in our outfit. A lot of them they're getting a lot, like Paul Potwin. He'd spend every one, but he's got 3. He just found out this last week that he had 3 different diseases, and one of them is pancreatic cancer, which is and they don't even give him 6 months to live. And one of them is brain cancer, and he went in for one simple test, and he came out with 3 different. And Paul Potwin, he was not only over in Bikini Atoll, but he was also at the Nevada test site where the Marines went, and he stuck his bayonet in Ground Zero after an atomic test there. So he's been exposed more than the average guy, but it's just because of health. Jack Cruz, he just passed away. But the guys are, Paul, and then the guy that found the most of us, and a lot of these guys have been exposed to Agent Orange, and that's what George Kelly passed away of, and he found most of us. He's an interesting guy that was from Tempe, Arizona, and he worked for the police department, and he had access in the police database. He worked in computers there to find most of us, and George was a interesting guy.
So to all those guys that have passed, if you had to say something to them, what would you say?
Yeah, I enjoyed every minute with them. Those guys, they would guard your back. They were great guys to live with. They were great examples. They were great human beings, and it made me proud to serve with them. It made me a better person, just serving with them. They were great guys. And then there's some guys that have never come to our reunion. One guy, he was in charge of the tests up at Magoo of where they would shoot intercontinental all the way to Eniwetok. And this guy, his wife died at the age of 40 of cancer, and then he married a young gal, and she took him for everything he had, and he wouldn't. And George told him he'd give him all the money he needed to come to the reunion, pay for his air ticket, pay for everything. The guy, he was too proud to come, and we went and had Mackenzie and myself and another guy, Thornton. We went and visited with him and had lunch with him.
All right, that's all we need to know
Okay.
for now.